We'll be accommodating of that fact, but I think we should get started because we don't have much time. We want to give our speaker today as much time as possible. Devon W. Carbado is the editor of Race Law Stories and a professor in the UCLA School of Law. Devon, who recently served as Vice Dean of the faculty, teaches constitutional criminal procedure, constitutional law, critical race theory, and criminal adjudication. He was elected professor of the UCLA School of Law classes of 2000 and 2006, is the 2003 recipient of the Rudder Award for Excellence in Teaching, and was recently awarded the University's Distinguished Teaching Award, the Evie Award for the Art of Teaching. He is a recipient of the Fletcher Foundation Fellowship, which modeled on the Guggenheims, is awarded to scholars whose work furthers the goals of Brown versus Board of Education. He writes in the areas of critical race theory, employment discrimination, criminal procedure, constitutional law, and identity. He is a former director of the Critical Race Studies program at UCLA Law, a faculty associate of the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies, I'm proud to announce, and a board member of the African American Policy Forum and Jamestown Fellow. My colleague, Devon W. Carbado.
Well, it's really great to be here and to have an opportunity to engage you around this book, which took far too long to produce, but happily it is here, and I have an opportunity to share with you some of the ideas upon which it is based. So what I thought I might do today is really the following. One, give you a quick sense of the nature of the book and the broader context out of which it arises. Two, focus in on a few of the chapters so that you have a specific indication of the doctrinal questions and issues about racial justice that these chapters present. And three, relate it to some additional scholarly projects that I'm now involved in to sort of give you a sense of where I'm taking my work next. So with respect to the book itself, the book is entitled Race Law Stories. And the first thing you should know, I suppose, is that it's part of a broader series of texts, law series texts, that Foundation Press puts out. So one of the ways in which we study law, the dominant way in law, is by reading appellate opinions, which is to say the opinions that judge writes, that reaches to the level of the Supreme Court, or intermediate appellate courts. What that means is that law students oftentimes don't have an understanding of the broader context within which cases are litigated. Foundation Press then took it upon itself to put together a series of books. So there's a contracts law stories, a property law stories, a criminal law stories, and the basic idea, again, behind these texts is to provide students with a broader context for thinking about litigation. Who are the parties? Who are the judges? Who are the lawyers? What might we understand about the specific doctrinal changes that are occurring in law as a function of the players? What about the historical context within which the case is litigated? How might that shape our understanding of cases? Think about Brown v. Board of Education, for example. Many of you have read that opinion. To what extent would your understanding of that case be limited if all you had was Justice Warren's opinion? Enough is the thinking, and so part of the effort then is to broaden one's understanding of law by looking specifically at the political, social, and ideological context in which cases are produced, as well as the parties who are involved. So that's the broad context for thinking about the book. Now, the second context for thinking about the book is to raise a question about how law figures in law school curricula. And you should know that UCLA, at this point, is the only law school in the country with a critical race theory concentration, right? We refer to it as critical race studies, but in fact, it's a critical race theory concentration. What that means concretely is that the notion that you would organize a book around the idea of a race law canon is contestable indeed. Many people would say that some of the cases that figure in race law stories ought to be subsumed in other categories of law, like, for example, constitutional law. So clearly, Brown v. Board of Education raises constitutional questions. Dred Scott raises constitutional questions. Kamatsu, the internment case, raised constitutional questions. So one could say, why do you need a race law story when many of the cases that you are covering in race law stories are covered in other areas of law? So that's one issue. The second issue is assuming that there is a space for a race law canon. What does that canon look like? That, too, is a highly contested issue within the domain of law. So there are lots of questions then, both about the legitimacy of a project like this one, and then, too, about the question of what it might mean to organize a curriculum around race. Now, I should say at the outset that when Rachel and Moran and I conceived of this book, we do not present it as a definitive, once and for all representation of a race law canon. Our thinking is that it is just a starting point. And let me then give you a sense as to what this starting point looked like. So we organized the book into several sections. So the first section is called Birth of a Nation, Formal Citizenship and Sovereignty. And we wanted to make clear throughout this book that the project of race is a multiracial one. That is to say, whether you're thinking about racial profiling, whether you think about nationhood, whether you're thinking about colonialism and conquest, all racial groups are implicated. And one of the ways we wanted to convey that idea is to present the issue of racial subordination across racial groups in each section of the book. So think about what this might look like concretely in part one. So we have as our starting chapter, a chapter on the Cherokee Nations. And I'll say something about what that case is all about, but as you might imagine, it concerns Native Americans and the extent to which they are interested in securing their sovereignty as against the backdrop of colonialism and conquest. So how do Native people struggle for self-determination and sovereignty in the context of colonialism? That's what the first chapter is about. Chapter 2 focuses on slavery. This too clearly is an issue about nationhood. This too is an issue about sovereignty. Now the case that we don't figure here is Dred Scott, right? People know an awful lot about Dred Scott. They know decidedly less about Piggy, Pennsylvania. So I'll say something about that case and its relationship to Dred Scott in a minute as well. The third case that we focus on is Wong Kim Ark. This case focused specifically on the question of Chinese identity vis-a-vis questions of nationhood. What's significant about this case is this. So it's litigated after the 14th Amendment is a part of our constitutional order, meaning the amendment that provides that to the extent that you're born in the United States, you're citizens of the United States. Well, notwithstanding that amendment, there was still a question about whether people of Chinese descent could, by birth, be citizens. So, to say it again, the 14th Amendment is on the books, and there's still a question about whether, because Chinese people are so different, the fact of birth standing alone would be insufficient to confer citizenship. So that case centers on that particular issue. And finally, there's a question about the status of Puerto Rico. To what extent does the Constitution follow the flag to domains that are not fully incorporated in the United States? So we know that Puerto Rico was part of the prize of the Spanish-American War. What are the results of that vis-a-vis questions of citizenship? The short of the story is that the Constitution is not fully applicable to Puerto Rico. It's not fully applicable because Puerto Rico is not a state, and the specific language that the court employs in the case around which this chapter is structured is that Puerto Rico is foreign in a domestic sense. It's not quite non-American, it's foreign in a domestic sense, and there are tremendous implications from that particular formal regime, which is still in place, which is still robust. So colonialism is alive and well, even in the context of current day American constitutional order. So you might appreciate already then that as we organize the book, we try to think about how to tell a multiracial story about conquest and expansionism, and that's roughly what part one of the book endeavors to do. Part two of the book, and you can't see the heading, separate and unequal classification and cost. Now, when we think about separate and unequal, we're thinking particularly about Black African American experience in the States. That makes perfect sense. But again, part of what we want to suggest in this book is that the regime of Jim Crow is not exhausted by that particular racial subjectivity. So the starting point for thinking about separate and equal is not Jim Crow itself, but slavery. And it's an interesting case that involves the assertion of freedom on the part of three women. These women are asserting their freedom not based on the idea that they're not of African descent, but on the idea that they're of native descent. So the argument in this case is not that they're white, but they're native. There are lots of cases in which litigants in the context of slavery are asserting freedom based on the argument that they're not of African descent, that they're white. This case is not that one. This case is about people saying, we are of native descent, and therefore we should be free. And what's robust about this case is the language in which the court employs to think about the issue of freedom. Let's look at the nature of these women's hair, long, straight, Laxon. Let's compare it to the woolly head of the Negroes. Let's look at their facial features. It's an explicit articulation of a set of phenotypic criteria that the court employs to manage the question of whether or not these women are going to be free. So these women, the freedom of these women, turn on the fact that they have long, straight, black hair. That's the basis on which they're free. And in thinking about how to adjudicate that question, the court puts in place this burden shifting regime. Like, let's say a person comes before you as the judge. You have woolly hair, right? Flat nose. This is the court's language. Big lips. What are you supposed to do? You presume that the person is a slave, and the burden is on the litigant to demonstrate freedom. Right, so this is burden-shifting regime that's explicitly in place, which provides a concrete indication of the way in which the law constructs race. Sometimes that idea is very abstract. What does it mean to say that the law constructs race? It's not abstract in this case at all. You see the explicit articulation of racial criteria that the court mobilizes to make a determination as to whether or not the litigants in this case are going to be free. So Yellow by Law, this is a chapter that I author, and it's fundamentally about the extent to which people of Japanese descent are naturalizable. It's litigated against the backdrop of a naturalization statute that provides initially that you need to be a free white person in order to be naturalizable. It is then modified in the context of Reconstruction to include persons of African nativity, and ultimately allows for people of African nativity to be naturalized, and the question becomes, to what extent does that regime render people of Japanese descent naturalizable? Yes? Become an American citizen not by birth, but by a statutory process. So if you reside in the United States, for example, for a certain number of years, if you speak English, etc., there are a set of rules that allows one to acquire American citizen on terms other than birth. And historically, those terms were explicitly racialized. So the first statute said you cannot become an American citizen if you are white, and then it's modified to say you cannot become an American citizen if you are not white or if you are not a person of African nativity. But race in both statutory regimes function as a basis for acquiring American citizenship. Okay? So this chapter focuses squarely on that particular issue and looks at the terms upon which Ozawa, who is a litigant, articulates why he should be naturalizable. And I'll say something more about that later on. Morton v. Mancari is a case that centers on native identity. It's a quote-unquote an affirmative action case in the sense that it involves whether or not the Bureau of Indian Affairs can have in place a regime that authorizes its officials to take race into account when deciding who to promote. Okay, so this issue is contested in the context of this case, and the court has to decide to what extent are Native Americans a political group, or to what extent are they a racial group, right? Or to put it more precisely, to what extent does taking Native identity in account effectuates a political classification versus a racial classification. And the distinction is significant in the following sense. The court concludes that the decision using native identity as a basis for promotion is a political decision, even though the court does not conclude that people of native descent are not a racial group. So they're a racial group, but the decision on behalf of them is not a racial classification. And you should know that this case is litigated at a time when the Supreme Court is struggling with what to do with affirmative action. Should we subject affirmative action to a really heightened review, meaning it's almost always going to be rendered unconstitutional, or should we apply a lax review? Well, if you make the classification something other than race, it looks very good for the court, meaning the court is not likely to invalidate it. If you make the classification a racial classification, the court is deeply suspicious of it and is likely to render it constitutionally infirm, right? So in a way, this is a case not about the court respecting native sovereignty. It's a case about the court punting on the question of what to do about affirmative action. And the punt takes the form of concluding that what we have here is a political classification and not a racial classification. That's at least one way in which to understand the case. And certainly Carol Goldberg, who is my colleague and authors this chapter, hints at the extent to which that's going on. And finally, the chapter concludes, this section rather concludes a discussion of Hernandez v. Texas, and this is a really crucial case. This case is litigated precisely at the moment of Brown v. Board of Education, which is to say it's decided in 1954, within weeks of Brown v. Board of Education, and centers on how the Equal Protection Clause is going to apply to people of Mexican descent. And crucially, in finding for the litigants in this case, and it was a case about the extent to which people of Mexican descent were systematically excluded from the grand jury, that's roughly what the case is about, and whether that exclusion raises an equal protection problem. The court doesn't articulate its ruling explicitly in racial terms, meaning the court doesn't say Mexican Americans are a distinct racial group. It does not do so. In that respect, there's a huge difference between the racial language of Brown v. Board of Education, a case that is explicitly racialized discursively, and the language in this case, a case that avoids the idea of Mexican Americans as a cognizable group, even though it does recognize their discrimination. And so part of what he and Amy Lopez and Michael Olivias suggest in this chapter is that this case is productive if we think about the possibility of reaching subordination without necessarily naming race. So when you add this case to Brown v. Board of Education, it actually is very robust and might lead to, for example, class-based claims in addition to race-based claims. It might be helpful in the context of sexual orientation because it doesn't specifically talk about groups as such. So they want to think about what it might mean if equal protection law grapples not just with Brown, but with this case. And of course, part of the story they tell is that Latino and Mexican American subjectivity in law remains somewhat marginalized, which is why we don't know about this case. And if we actually understood what's going on with this case, we'd actually have a more robust, a thicker conception of equality in the context of the equal protection jurisprudence. So part 3 of the book focuses on that dreaded term colorblindness, the term that does so much work juridically and sociopolitically as well, so much work in fact that we in California are obviously operating under its racial weight, you might say. So our starting point for thinking about colorblindness is Hirabayashi, the United States, chapter that my colleague Jerry Kang authors, and it centers on the internment. And the internment of Japanese American is really crucial for a number of reasons, but particularly crucial for thinking about colorblindness. Because the doctrine that we now employ, and I'll say something more about this a little later, the doctrine that we now employ to think about whether race-based classifications are constitutional comes from this case and another, Hirabayashi and Karamatsu. And part of what Jerry Kang does in this chapter is to illustrate just how careful the court was in avoiding the issue of internment. So in this case, Hirabayashi, for example, the court could have decided the issue of evacuation. So you can separate internment in a fictional sense into curfew, evacuation, and detention. You can separate those parts out, right? As if they all don't occur at the same time, right? There's a curfew, then you're removed, and you end up in a camp. But you can certainly separate them out if you want to play that game, and that's exactly what the court does. So in Hirabayashi, for example, the court says, well, this case is really just about curfew, right? And the court can conclude that it's just about curfew because Gordon Hirabayashi was being punished both for a curfew violation and for an evacuation violation. But because his sentences ran concurrently, the court says, well, we don't have to deal with evacuation, we'll just deal with curfew, right? It makes it seem as though it's just curfew that's at stake. And what's so crazy about telling people that they have to go inside their homes at 9 o'clock during the context of war? That's not crazy. Even though it's impinging upon only one quote-unquote racial group, it's still not such a big deal. So if it's just about curfew and you need to get in by 9 o'clock, so what? Therefore it's constitutional. Enter Korematsu, which occurs later on. Korematsu now, the court makes about evacuation, not about detention, right? The case was fundamentally about detention. People were not being evacuated to nowhere, right? They were being evacuated to camp. But once again, the court disaggregates the issue of evacuation from the issue of detention, and it makes it an easier case for the court, right? So the court ultimately concludes, therefore, that the internment was okay for reasons that Kang goes into. So Paris v. Shaw. We're all familiar with Loving v. Virginia, right? How many of us are familiar with Paris v. Shaw? One of the questions that Robin Linhart wants to ask in this question is, why aren't we loving Paris v. Shaw? And she's raising that question because this is a 1940s California case that involves an anti-miscegenation statute, a statute that, again, prevents whites from marrying non-whites. And what's interesting about this case is that the woman is Mexican, the man is black. The Mexican woman is constructed as white for the purpose of this case. That's why it raises an anti-miscegenation concern. And part of what she wants to do in this case is several things. One is to suggest that, look, here is a story about anti-miscegenation that does not take the standard black-white form, meaning whiteness figures, but by the embodiment of a Mexican identity. So we need to think about what that means. Two, it's a case that's not litigated at the level of the Supreme Court. It's a lower court case, and specifically a California case. And what does that mean for our concerns about equality? Three, so Paris v. Shaw is a case that same-sex couples have been using an awful lot in making arguments about equality in the context of marriage. So we need to be thinking about Paris v. Shaw in that sense as well. And the fourth claim she makes is that Paris v. Shaw might actually be a more robust case than Loving, even as it creates a condition of possibility for Loving as well. So it's a wonderful story about how these two people meet, about what their life was like, and about why they decided to contest the terms upon which the state said they could get married. The third chapter in this section is an affirmative action chapter that I won't say much about except this. It's a chapter that is fundamentally about the extent to which the court is going to take seriously or not issues of white flight and what that means vis-a-vis power in particular municipalities. So concretely, to what extent does an affirmative action program look suspect, particularly when the local government is controlled by blacks? And part of what the court says is you're especially worried about affirmative action programs when the local government in the city of Richmond is black, ignoring the history of discrimination in that domain, and ignoring just how disempowered that municipal or local government was vis-a-vis the dynamics of white. So part of what Reggie and Thomas Ross do in this chapter is to say, what would our understanding of that case look like if we're not simply talking about power vis-a-vis the city government, we're talking about power with respect to the suburbanization and white flight more generally. And the final chapter here is a chapter on racial profiling. It's a chapter that one wouldn't necessarily expect to see in a race law stories book, in part because racial profiling is conceptualized as a criminal process problem that doesn't necessarily enter into curricular conversations about race, which tend to be dominated by equal protection concerns. So the rough way to think about this case is to imagine that Paul von Blum and I are, again, leaving UCLA today, let's say. We're both in our cars, let's say. We're driving down Westwood Boulevard, let's say. And the police plan to stop both of us, let's say. They know that one of us is black and the other one is white. And again, we'll stipulate that I am the black person. And the police stop me, and they stop me because I am black. We're stipulating all of that. They find stuff in my car. I want to suppress the stuff based on the idea that they stopped me because I'm black. Do I get to suppress the stuff? No, I do not. Right? The court says that they had reason to stop me if I'm speeding as well, or if I go through a traffic light. The fact that they stopped me because I am black doesn't matter. I don't get to suppress that evidence. So this case is a story about why we might think about racial profiling in a broad and theoretical sense, why we should have normative concerns about how that case comes out, and who these police officers were. So it turns out that these police officers were perjurers. They perjured themselves in subsequent cases, and Kevin Johnson illustrates that for us. The final section of this book focuses on race-conscious remedies explicitly, and the first chapter is by my co-author Rachel Moran, who looks at Grutter v. Bollinger, which is the Supreme Court case involving the affirmative action programs at Michigan Law School and at the undergraduate program as well. So she tells a very compelling story about the fragmentation of the court on issues of affirmative action and why we will continue to see it contested, not just in the judicial arena, but in the political arena as well. Shaw v. Reno is a crucial case about remedies. It's about voting rights. To what extent can we have majority-minority districts? In the age of Obama, maybe no more. If we elect a black president, do we need a regime that allows for the election of majority black districts, or does that violate our norm of color blindness? In chapter 15, we have a very interesting story about Native Hawaiian sovereignty. So we call the Morton v. Moncari chapter, the chapter in which the Supreme Court says it's a political classification when you take Native identity into account. Here, the court reaches just the opposite conclusion. Now, right, when the court is confident about what racial classification means, and it wants to delegitimize them, it says the decision in this case to take Native Hawaiian identity into account vis-a-vis voting practices is a racial classification, and it is therefore unconstitutional. So now the court is totally comfortable with the idea of racial classification. The ambivalence that we see in Morton v. Moncari in the 70s has disappeared. Colorblindness reigns supreme. This violates colorblindness. You're not a sovereign people. You're not a political people. You're a racial people. Do not take race into account. That's a problem, says the court. And in a way, my favorite chapter is Rogers v. Williams. It's an interesting chapter because it invokes the moment in which it brings Bo Derek into race-conscious remedies. Well, how, you might say, how would that be? And she does an awful lot of work in this context. So let me just say something about that and then shut up and take some questions. So what's going on here? Renee Rogers works for American Airlines. She has her hair in braids. The airline says, I think you already know how this story goes, the airline says you cannot do that, there's a no braids policy. Renee Rogers sues. She says this is a problem based on race and gender together, and therefore my claim should be cognizable. American Airlines should be forced to stop the madness. American Airlines says, not so quick. I've seen tan, I've seen Bo Derek in braids. Your claim that this affects only black women is falsifiable based on Bo Derek, you lose. Right? So quite literally, Renee Rogers loses her claim based in no small part to the idea that braided hair is not unique to black women, C.E.G. Bo Derek. Now, part of the broader story that Paula Carbado tells is based on the work of my colleague Kimberly Crenshaw that demonstrates just how difficult it has historically been for black women and women of color more generally to assert claims of discrimination based on race and gender. Happily, race and gender claims are today cognizable. They're difficult to bring as an evidentiary matter, but they're nevertheless cognizable. This case presents one juridical moment in which the court invokes Bo Derek in order to resist the application of that theory to the case. So that gives you just a very quick sense of what this book is about. Obviously, it's not exhaustive, but you'll see through each section that our attempt was to be somewhat multiracial. Clearly, it remains incomplete. Clearly, it's not a definitive account, but our hope is that it will at least generate a conversation about what a race law canon might look like, and in subsequent iteration, grapple with issues that we do not fully grapple with here. Questions of foreign policy, for example, additional questions of structural racism and what the role the law might play in all of that. But our hope is that at least it's a point of departure for future conversations and texts on this issue. So why don't we stop there and take any questions or comments that you might have.
Hold on.
Yeah.
At the risk of sensationalizing your wonderful discussion about your book, can I ask if you yourself have ever been subjected to racial discrimination?
I don't know where to begin. Maybe it's that I don't know where to stop. So, short answer, yes, but maybe you're hoping for more reasoned elaboration. And I guess there are various moments and various kinds, and one particular moment that is striking to me and was the basis for a theoretical understanding of race is police interactions and what they do. So I'm always fond of saying that I became a black American before I became an American citizen. That is to say, my American identity was in very significant ways forged through racism in that sense. So one can think of racism as a naturalization process, a process by which people actually become American. Indeed, that's a claim that I advance, that I became black American via racism in large part, which is not to say that I'm overdetermined by it, or that is the full content of my identity, but it certainly is an important part of it. Kind of comments and questions. Yeah.
So the last chapter, I'm really glad that you brought that up because even though I'm one of his students, I live from the law school, and so the only way that I see what Caldwell describes as the intersectional bias, one of the ways I see it still playing out as far as the race and gender claims is that class actions brought by women of color asserting race and gender claims are often not certified. So sometimes maybe, if you're lucky, you can bring an individual suit and maybe you can, meet the burden of proof. But as far as class actions go, and broader change, race and gender are still not, there's still a conflict there. The courts see the conflict of interest between bringing race and gender claims. So that's
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think class action might be one context where it's especially difficult, but I think it remains difficult in the garden variety Title VII context. It remains difficult in instances in which a person might be arguing that black women were systematically excluded from the jury. So there are a number of domains where theoretically the claim might be cognizable, but it's difficult to establish at the end of the day. Yeah.
So you discussed Shelby Reno and this issue of majority-minority voting districts, and the Supreme Court has granted cert to a voting rights case this year that about a municipality in Texas that's trying to get out of the requirements of the Voting Rights Act. And there has been talk on the court of an attempt, language by Justice Roberts in the dissent that said, it's time to end this voting rights by race sort of idea. Where do you think the court is going to fall on this upcoming case? How do you think Kennedy is going to swing?
One never knows how Kennedy is going to One always hopes that he swings the right, which is to say the left way, but I'm just going to know, and I think it's a very, very, very real question. Meaning, think about the extent to which the discourse of post-racialism has been coextensive with a fetish about racial demographics. So even as we're saying things like, this is what the black vote is doing, or these are how black people thinking about Obama, these are how Latinos are thinking, these are Asian Americans, etc. Even in the moment that we're doing that, we're talking about post-racialism with no sense of contradiction.
Yeah.
So I worry deeply about what that might mean concretely vis-a-vis the requirements of the Voting Rights Act and its implication in the context of majority-minority districts. I worry about that. I haven't looked specifically at what the underlying fact of this particular case is. I just don't know. So I have to think harder about it. But am I worried? Yes. Am I guardedly optimistic? Yes. Because I think that eliminating that to core might be something that even this court is not ready for. Yeah.
How far, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
How far do you think this country has come in terms of the issues that you're talking about since, take the median years of the cases that are in the book? How far has it come now? How does that compare? Let's say in Europe, some maybe Anglo-Saxon, UK or Germany, France.
Yeah, so I'm not a student of race relations in each of those domains. What I will say is that America's come incredibly far. I don't know that anyone can really push back too strenuously against that. The question is whether or not the place at which we have arrived is, salvation in terms of race, as it were. And I think the answer to that is no. And so we tend to fetishize symbols and formalism perhaps too much. I mean, Barack Obama ascendancy to the forefront of American politics means a lot. And I don't think we should downplay what that means. And I also think it's a moment in which we should check ourselves in terms of race as well, precisely because it wasn't a moment that many of us imagined as a possibility. And because it wasn't a moment in which many of us imagined as a possibility, we have to think hard about what the limits of our racial imaginations in that sense. Having said all of that, though, what has changed materially? Right? So if we had a set of demographics about incarceration, about political disempowerment, about health disparities, about educational inequalities, about employment disparities, if we have a set of demographics that we just stuck on the board pre-Obama, I think they survived post-Obama. Right? So it's important that we recognize that there has been some shift, the ground has moved, but in many ways the material conditions are still there. So maybe this moment is about how we engage in a certain kind of racial advocacy and not whether the need for racial advocacy is over.
Yeah. I just want to follow up on that question. I guess you sort of anticipated some of what I was going to ask. And it really does go to where we are now with the recent election of Obama and Eric Holder, the Justice Department. The fact that the courts have obviously over the last 20, 25 years been constructed in a way that's had pretty dire impacts on sort of how we think about sort of a progressive racial agenda, as articulated by some of those stories that you've been talking about. But what about the prospects for the next few years? I mean, how long does it take to reverse some of what's been done? I mean, if you look at the Supreme Court and you look at the balance right now in the Supreme Court, who's likely to be there, who's likely to leave. I mean, what can we actually anticipate in terms of I guess, legal re-articulations of some of these questions in coming years?
Well, I think you framed it right, which is to say legal re-articulations. I do think that this is a moment where we have to step back and ask ourselves to what extent can we reframe some of the central questions that have been presented before the court over the past 2 decades. So one concrete issue has to do with racial preferences. That's just an example. Now, we tend to think about affirmative action as this narrow thing. Affirmative action is just about inclusion in institutional higher education. In fact, affirmative action and the way it's litigated has far-reaching implications. One only has to think about the most recent cases, the Louisville cases that were not about affirmative action, cases that were about integration in the context of primary and secondary schools, but that were constructed as racial preferences because of the work that racial preferences does. So that suggests to me that one of the things that we have to begin doing is attacking the idea that taking race into account is a racial preference. So this particular notion is not at all contestable in the media. There's a debate about whether affirmative action is a racial preference. You wouldn't know it from listening to NPR, reading the New York Times, but because it's affirmative action, it's a racial preference. That's a fact. That's a fact in ways that I think we need to push back against. It's not to say that it goes without saying that affirmative action is not a racial preference. That's not the claim. The point is rather that there's a debate about it, a debate that does not travel in public discourse, a debate that does not travel in the media, and a debate that has serious implications, not just for affirmative action in its narrow sense, but for the very voting rights regime that we just talked about, right? But for efforts to integrate public schools, and think about the extent to which the language of class is employed in this domain as well. So every time affirmative action is challenged, it's with the idea that we need to fix K-12 education, right? Now, I don't know about you, but I've not seen any of the proponents of 209 doing anything about K-12 in this state. And systematically, you can look at how class operates not as a vehicle for actually getting equality, but as a discourse to actually suppress race. And so it's important, I think, that we ask some first principle questions that we've kind of seeded and need to sort of reclaim in the hope of sort of shifting the terms upon which race is talked about in the public arena, and certainly the way in which it's litigated on the court. Yeah.
Kind of along the lines of what we were just talking about in this kind of frame shifting thing, we talk about Obama and his ability to kind of change the dialogue about the abortion issue around really pro-life with a lot of the right wing. You know, how do you think that's going to play out with the court and, you know, everything with the Supreme Court and everything in between as this moves along? I mean, is there really going to be this look at abortion by people that are quote-unquote pro-life as really we're looking at life here, and we're looking at, you know, babies that are born and that, you know, are born into poverty and, you know, that whole spectrum versus, oh, you know, pro-life is anti-abortion and anti-stem cell research?
Well, I think that's a perfect example of the extent to which a certain way of talking about an issue has been claimed as exclusively the province of one ideological set of ideas, and I think that there is some space for reclamation of what it might mean to be pro-life, just as there's some space to reclaim what it might mean to value spirituality or religion, just as there's some space about what it might mean to claim social responsibility. Now, each of these terms, of course, are ideologically loaded in a particular way, right? But the question becomes, what does one do with that? Sometimes terms are too overdetermined and you just gotta say no. I'm quoting Nancy Reagan. Other times, you have to think about whether or not they're available for co-optation. Certainly, that's what the right does, right? colorblindness, Martin Luther King's dream, etc. I mean, colorblindness wasn't always a dirty word in terms of race. Now it certainly is. Right? And think about just how successful. I mean, civil rights projects on the part of the right get more funding than civil rights projects on the part of the left. And their name's the Civil Rights Project, right? So I think we have to think harder about what's available for co-optation and what isn't. And I don't know that we do that enough.
Going back to colorblindness again.
Yeah.
I just read Racism Without Racists by Eduardo Benito, and he was saying how surveys aren't really doing as much good anymore in terms of determining Americans' racial attitudes because people have gotten smarter about how they answer surveys. So I was just wondering how that would impact affirmative action litigation in the future, if at all, since we're moving towards a sort of colorblind paradigm in this country.
Well, I think it's true that people have gotten smarter about what their express commitments might be. They haven't gotten smart about what they contain in their head, right? Which is to say, implicit bias still reveals some stuff. And so I think one has to think about different sources of knowledge. I'm not a huge fan of the scientification of racial discourse because of the work that historically has done, but I am willing to be pragmatic about these things. And so we're having a conference in a couple of weeks looking precisely at the ways in which one might harness social science, including but not limited to implicit bias, to intervene in some of these conversations, right? And Donald can speak more authoritatively about this than I, but this is a question that sociology faces as well. I mean, how do you get people to respond in ways that can then be mobilized to do social policy work? That's not an easy methodological question to engage, but happily there are lots of different ways to pursue that undertaking, and as people get smarter, so do social scientists like Donald.
Do you think that English language proficiency is a tool in this system? And do you know of any court cases that bring up this issue?
Has English language proficiency historically been a tool of racism? Yes. Are there manifestations of that today? Certainly. And it depends on what you might be thinking about in terms of English language proficiency. So we could be talking about issues of bilingualism. We could be talking about access discrimination. We could be talking about English-only regimes, etc. And each of those can clearly be projects of racism. Sometimes they're expressly so, with that intent, but even when they're not, they can have disparate racial impacts, which then further marginalizes certain communities. So I do think that historically there has been a profound relationship between questions of language on the one hand and racial subordination on the other, and the law has not been terribly helpful in this respect. So it's difficult, for example, to bring an accent discrimination claim. It's enormously difficult to win. It's difficult politically to have conversations about the extent to which English hegemony might, in fact, marginalize certain communities. That's not a conversation that people typically want to have, and it's not usually a leading civil rights claim, right? We get to language after you've gotten to a whole set of other issues, and maybe we haven't thought hard enough about how to contest that particular area of civil rights, and so we're not as good as we might be.
I know you wrote something about Obama's speech on race, responding to what the Reverend had said, and I'm wondering I didn't get it from what you wrote, but what is your take on how he actually deployed race? I was thinking it was pretty clever strategically. He was talking in a race conscious way, but in a way that might actually hopefully not alienate white folks, and he's trying to sort of filter out that white guilt that they might feel. But there are parts where it's like education opportunities for black, brown, and white children, making that a reality. And so he sort of diluted race, but also mentioned it. So I'm wondering how you view that, his talk.
Yeah, so and there's a lot of people on and on about that particular text, and certainly combining it with his other speeches, it's right for engagement. I mean, I suppose, lots of people have been thinking about the multiple voices with which Obama speaks. And the question becomes, what is that about? So one view, it's just authentic Obama. It's who he is at this particular time. It's how he has ascended the political, descended the political ladder, etc. So it's just who he is. Another view is that he's being deeply pragmatic, and that is really cause for concern. Because if he's pragmatic in that way, and race is to some degree unspeakable for him, well, certainly not speakable in the way that it is in Dreams of My Father. I mean, we don't really hear that Obama very much in terms of his public performances. It means that it's going to be unspeakable when he's in office. And I thought the way to think about it cool is to say that, look, this is a kind of reverse hegemony moment. Right? They don't know it, but he's got them. And he is a certain language that enables him to perform that kind of progressive work. So we understand how hegemony works, right? But we're typically thinking about the extent to which it is deployed by the right, let's say, to dupe the people who are marginalized. This is about duping the privileged, right? So it's kind of reverse hegemony in that sense. And one can certainly make that claim, whether we all buy it, I don't know. So those are just three rough possibilities that I don't think we in this room will necessarily agree as to which one is the real deal.
Proof is in the pudding.
Proof is in the pudding. And then there's a question is, what is the pudding? I think that's it as well.
Which one do you think it is, Professor?
I'm not going to stake out a position here. Well, great. Well, thank you all for your comments.
For those of you who'd like to stay around, we have representatives from SO1 who will making books available, and also Professor Carbado will be signing them.
I know.
Yeah, a couple of weeks.
35, 35, 75. Yeah.
The end of March.
Yeah.
There you go.